Well, hello everyone. Back for another video. Back in my late teens, my favorite book was a novel called Ishmael by Daniel Quinn. This video is not really about that book, but I am going to summarize a portion of it. There's a portion in the book where an anthropologist is interviewing a starfish and asks them to describe their creation myth. And the starfish isn't really sure what they meant by that. And the anthropologist clarifies, well, in your culture, how did your world come to be? What do you believe caused your world come to be? And the starfish says, well, I wouldn't call it a myth. Those are our sacred texts, as one does. The starfish goes on to give a modified form of the 7 days of creation in the Holy Bible. And at the end of the story, in the Bible, where on the last day God creates man, in the starfish's version, God creates starfish. The point of this allegory is to kind of point out the fact that in a lot of major religions, they have a creation myth, some sort of telling of how the universe came to be, the world, and then the people on it. And it always ends with, and then God, whoever their God is, made man. And this sort of inadvertently or not smuggles in this notion of anthropocentrism, a human-centric universe, as if the point of it all is for us. It's not for the whales, it's not for the trees, it's not for the bees, it's for man. And it got me to thinking, a lot of what modern liberal Western society is built upon comes from a creation myth. If we look back at the way the world views the 20th century history from World War II onward. So you could say it goes something like God creates the world, and it creates three ideologies, and one of them is liberalism. And the other ideologies, whether or not they have their differences, are basically Satan. And then liberalism won, and it demonstrated that the purpose of the world was for liberalism. And we could finally end our long quest for truth. And we had arrived at the promised land once we had realized we just needed to concede to liberalism and all our problems would go away. And this is the pervasive mindset that you see in books like Francis Fukuyama's End of History. It is very much prefaced as if liberalism is the point of society up until the point at which it was discovered. Liberalism is the culmination, the final product of pre-industrial society upon which it can finally springboard into a promised land. And you can see how this shapes a lot of our blind spots, our cultural blind spots, and how we identify heresies in a very real quasi-religious way in ideals that are not liberal. The liberal rejection of normative standards for beauty, the liberal rejection of unequalizing differences between people, the liberal rejection of order and tradition and hierarchy. The ultimate end of liberalism is to detach the self from a greater society, to abstract it from any sort of responsibility to a community, to a state, to a family even. And what this results in is a almost invisible barrier between the people for whom liberalism is the waters they swim in and any sort of alternative mode of thinking. Liberalism has basically become a default dialectic, a mode of moral processing for all things, and is inherently incompatible with, among other things, pre-industrial modes of thought. This is why we have such inane reactions to things such as the Sydney Sweeney controversy. The American Eagle ad, in a lot of ways, is a very uncommon embrace in the modern day of implicitly traditional values that have been, in my opinion, wrongfully anchored to fascism. Because fascists did hearken back to a golden era of beauty, of order, of hierarchy, and believed that there was a true beauty, not necessarily a subjective beauty, but a metric by which we can truly ascertain what is beautiful. And people are mad that, when we don't think about it, when we don't second guess ourselves, and we don't take time and ask, oh, am I having the correct state-sponsored opinion? More people will find Sydney Sweeney attractive than, someone who's overweight, doesn't take care of themselves. She has good genes, and she happens to be white, but that's neither here nor there. This causes such a averse reaction because in the liberal religion, in its creation myth, this has basically turned this sort of notion of true beauty into a heresy, because it forces people to confront the fact that when we don't abstract the notions of beauty, some things are better than others. Some people are better, some people are smarter, some more charismatic, some more athletic. And this is a direct affront to liberalism. In order for the project of the individual abstracted from the rest of society and to not be tethered by pre-existing notions of responsibility to society, to a state, to a family, you have to have everyone be equal, because otherwise, when people are on their own as individuals, they cannot achieve, they cannot participate with equal fulfillment with other people. And I do think that is part of the reason why liberalism evolved the managerial state, which actively acts as a soft barrier to greatness and acts as a way of promoting the notion of subjective beauty, which people, if they're just acting on intuition, if they're not acting on what has been imposed upon them by external ideologies, they would just know is a falsehood. So the creation myth effectively establishes liberalism as the normative, the center by which things stray in one direction or the other as a form of divergence, as an anomaly. And you cannot have that in a devout religious circumstance. With a creation myth, you see yourself as the anointed, as the promised people. And anything that is incongruent with the story that accompanies the creation myth is something that has to be rejected via naive realism. Naive realism is a psychological phenomenon where people conflate their own positions, their moral, philosophical, ideological positions as the norm. And they get surprised when they discover that other people don't feel the same, because they're under the impression that they are the norm, that they're the default, This happens a lot when people who come from a predominantly urban, liberal environment go into the much more traditional and ostensibly illiberal rural environment in which people have a very different worldview because they have very different needs, they have very different community ties, and the naive realism forces them into a moment of cognitive dissonance where they realize that there are many, many parts of the world in which their perspective is not the norm, is the alien, the other, the outgroup. And I'm sure the inverse is very much the same when people in rural areas come into a more cosmopolitan, urbanized, and atomized society. They discover that they're not in Kansas anymore, and they have their own creation myths, often in the literal sense, the biblical sense. And this creates a clash of visions that cannot be reconciled and exposes the fatal flaw, in my opinion, of liberalism. Liberalism tries to posture itself as a morally neutral space. When it is implemented in the state acts as a mediator, a middle ground for competing ideas to hash it out. You know, person A wants thing X, person B wants thing Y, and the allegedly neutral liberal state acts as a mediator between the two and says, hey, maybe we can find a middle ground here. Well, the problem is sometimes this just cannot work logistically. Let's say that thing X that someone wants is burning all trees to the ground, and thing Y that the other person wants is trees never to be burned again. I could think of a more practical example, but there are a lot of instances where there isn't a middle ground. Let's say, gay marriage, for instance. Um, People are either going to feel pretty strongly one way or the other about it, and compromise is just not logistically. I mean, from their cultures, from their creation myth, not a tenable approach. And really, the only alternative here is for these people just not to live in the same communities, to have their own worlds, to have their own spaces, to live lives as they choose. And they cannot be governed by the same state. You can't have a mediating force, a neutral ground that tries to reconcile inherently incompatible views because they believe that the world was made for them. They believe that the world should be reshaped around them and the vision they have for a correct world because it is theirs. It is for them.